Julian Thorne strutted into the courtroom in his $10,000 Italian suit, convinced he was discarding a useless wife. He mistook my silence for fear. But he made the fatal error of every arrogant man on Wall Street. He forgot to check who signed the checks that sustained his empire for 5 years. He did not realize I was not his defendant, but the most ruthless creditor he had ever borrowed from. My name is Sophia Redmond, and if you were to believe the narrative currently being screamed across the polished mahogany of the courtroom, I am nothing more than a stain on the pristine lapel of New York high society. I sat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture deliberate and contained, making myself as small as possible in the heavy oak chair that felt designed to intimidate anyone without a 7-figure retainer fee. The air in the courtroom smelled of stale coffee, floor wax, and the acrid, metallic scent of Julian's desperation, though he would undoubtedly call it righteous indignation. Julian Thorne was performing. That was the only word for it. He paced the floor in front of the bench, his movements sweeping and theatrical, designed to catch the light and the attention of anyone present. He wore a navy blue bespoke suit that I knew cost exactly $10,000 because I was the one who had approved the expense report under the guise of household maintenance 3 months ago. It fit him perfectly, tapering at the waist to accentuate the athletic build he maintained with a personal trainer he saw 4 times a week, another expense I had silently authorized. But for all his sartorial perfection, Julian looked ugly in that moment. His face was flushed a deep, mottled crimson, and a vein in his forehead throbbed in time with his shouting. He pointed a manicured finger at me, the gold signet ring on his pinky catching the overhead fluorescent lights. She is a gold digger. Your Honor, a fraud. She trapped me into this marriage with a facade of sweetness. But the moment the ring was on her finger, she revealed her true nature. She is mentally unstable, emotionally volatile, and frankly, an embarrassment to everything I have built. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply watched the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight that cut across the defense table. To an outsider, my lack of reaction likely looked like the catatonia of a broken woman, or perhaps the guilt of someone who had no defense against the truth. That was exactly what Julian wanted them to see. He wanted a victim. He wanted a villain. He needed me to be the anchor dragging down his rising ship so that he could cut the chain and soar. Look at her, Julian bellowed, spinning on his heel to face the gallery, though it was mostly empty save for a few bored clerks and a reporter he had likely tipped off himself. She sits there and says nothing because she knows I am right. She has contributed absolutely nothing to our union. Nothing. While I was out there building Thorne Tech into the premier technology firm in the city, working 18 hours a day, what was she doing spending my money on useless online courses, art history philosophy, abstract concepts that bring zero value to the real world? I lowered my gaze to my own hands. I was wearing a gray button-down shirt that had seen better days. The fabric at the cuff was fraying slightly, a loose white thread dangling against my wrist. I resisted the urge to pull it. This shirt was a costume, just as much as his $10,000 suit was. It was the uniform of the downtrodden housewife, the woman who had been left behind by her husband's meteoric rise. Julian hated this shirt. He had told me once that it made me look like a charity case. Today, that was precisely the point. He was right about one thing, though. I had spent a considerable amount of money on courses over the last 5 years. But they were not in art history. They were advanced seminars on forensic accounting, international tax law, and corporate restructuring. I had spent thousands of hours studying the very mechanisms that men like Julian used to hide their wealth, and more importantly, the mechanisms used to dismantle them, but he never checked the credit card statements closely enough to see the vendor names. He just saw the total amount and screamed about my incompetence. I demand that this marriage be annulled on the grounds of fraud, Julian shouted, slamming his hand onto the railing of the witness stand. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. And I am countersuing for damages. The stress of dealing with her instability has impacted my ability to lead my company. My public image has suffered. Investors are asking questions. I want her to pay for the reputational damage she has inflicted upon me. She needs to leave this marriage with exactly what she brought into it, which is absolutely nothing. Beside him, his lawyer, Marcus Sterling, stood up. Marcus was a man who looked like he was made of oil and expensive cologne. He slicked his hair back and wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind of lawyer who specialized in bullying settlements out of people who could not afford to fight back. He was perfect for Julian. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice smooth and practiced, "we are submitting into evidence Exhibit A through Exhibit D." He lifted a thick, heavy binder that landed on the judge's bench with a dull thud. "These are sworn affidavits from Mr. Thorne's household staff, attesting to Mrs. Thorne's erratic behavior. We also have receipts showing reckless spending on frivolous educational materials, and most importantly, a psychological evaluation from a therapist Mrs. Thorne saw twice 4 years ago, suggesting a predisposition towards dependency and narcissistic injury." I looked at the binder. It was impressive in its bulk. They had really tried. They had taken every moment of my silence, every moment I had bitten my tongue rather than fight back, and twisted it into a diagnosis. They called my patience dependency. They called my strategic withdrawal instability. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, codified into legal documents. Julian was panting now, his chest heaving. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "She won't even look at me," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Look at her, head down, shoulders slumped. She is too ashamed to even face the man she has leeched off of for half a decade. She knows she is a fraud. She knows she belongs in a trailer park, not a penthouse." I adjusted the frayed cuff of my shirt again, feeling the rough texture of the cotton against my skin. It was a grounding sensation. I needed to stay in this moment. I needed to feel the weight of his words, the sting of his public humiliation. I filed every insult away, not into a place of hurt, but into a ledger in my mind. Every word he spoke was adding compound interest to the debt he was about to pay. The courtroom was silent for a long moment, save for Julian's heavy breathing. The presiding judge, Beatrice Halloway, had been watching the spectacle with an expression that could shatter granite. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair cut into a sharp bob and glasses that magnified her discerning eyes. She had seen hundreds of men like Julian Thorne. I wondered if she had ever seen a woman like me. She did not look at the binder Marcus had placed before her. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on Julian. Her face was a mask of judicial neutrality, but there was a sharpness in her gaze, a glint of something that looked dangerously like boredom mixed with irritation. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Halloway said, her voice quiet but carrying effortlessly to the back of the room, "you have made your position abundantly clear." "I am not finished," Julian interrupted. He actually interrupted a federal judge. His arrogance was a living thing, consuming his common sense. "I want it on record that I am the victim here. I am the one who has worked. I am the one who has sacrificed. She is nothing but a weight around my neck." I glanced at the old analog clock hanging on the back wall of the courtroom. The second hand was sweeping upward, ticking past the number 11, moving inexorably toward the 12. Tick, tick, tick. It was almost time. My heart rate remained steady, a slow, rhythmic drum in my chest. I thought about the irony of the situation. Julian believed he was the protagonist of this story. He believed this was the climax of his triumph, the moment he cast off the dead weight and ascended to his rightful place as the bachelor king of New York tech. He had no idea that he was merely a supporting character in a tragedy of his own making. The second hand clicked into place. The hour hand settled perfectly on the 10. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The banks were now open. The wire transfers I had scheduled 48 hours ago, timed to execute exactly upon the opening of business hours on this specific date, had just cleared. The intricate web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and blind trusts had completed its final rotation. I allowed myself a small movement. I lifted my head. For the first time since entering the courtroom, I looked directly at Julian. I did not look at him with the tearful, pleading eyes of the wife he thought he knew. I did not look at him with the anger of a scorned woman. I looked at him with the cold, flat assessment of a coroner examining a corpse. And then I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It did not reach my eyes. It was a small, sharp curvature of the lips, a signal flare in the dark. It was the smile of a hunter who heard the trap snap shut. Julian paused in the middle of a breath. He saw it. He saw the shift. For a fraction of a second, confusion flickered across his face, breaking the mask of his rage. He faltered, the rhythm of his tirade stumbling against the sudden, inexplicable confidence radiating from the woman he considered a doormat. But his ego was too large to allow the warning to register fully. He shook his head, as if to physically dispel the moment of doubt, and doubled down on his vitriol. He turned back to the judge, spreading his arms wide, encompassing the courtroom, the city, and the world he believed he owned. "Your Honor," Julian sneered, pointing back at me with a finality that he thought was the end of the war, but was in fact the first shot of his execution. "Look at that smile. She is delusional. She is completely detached from reality. Grant me this annulment and set me free. She is a parasite clinging to my success." The word parasite hung in the stagnant air of the courtroom, vibrating with a particularly ugly resonance. Julian spat the syllables out as if they tasted of bile. His face twisted into a mask of righteous victimhood, but as the echo of his insult faded, the walls of the courtroom seemed to dissolve around me. The smell of floor wax and stale coffee was replaced by the salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean and the cloying sweetness of expensive perfume. I was no longer sitting in a hard wooden chair in Manhattan. I was standing on the manicured lawn of our summer estate in the Hamptons. 3 months ago, surrounded by people who smiled with their teeth but never with their eyes. It was our 5th wedding anniversary, or rather, it was the party Julian had thrown to celebrate the acquisition of a rival startup, which simply happened to coincide with the date on our marriage license. The estate was lit by strings of Edison bulbs that cast a warm, golden glow over the white linen tents. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, their music struggling to compete with the roar of self-congratulatory conversation from the crowd. Julian was in his element. He stood near the champagne tower, holding a crystal flute, surrounded by potential investors and a few junior partners he enjoyed tormenting. I remembered approaching the circle, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres that a catering waiter had abandoned. I had picked it up instinctively, trying to be helpful, trying to ensure the perfection Julian demanded. I wore a dress I had bought off the rack at a department store. A simple navy sheath that Julian had sneered at earlier in the evening, calling it suburban. As I stepped into the light, Julian's eyes flicked to me. There was no warmth, no recognition of the 5 years we had shared. There was only annoyance that I had interrupted his monologue about market disruption. One of the investors, a heavy-set man with a red face and a louder laugh, gestured toward me with his glass. "Julian, you didn't tell us you hired new staff. The service here is impeccable." The group fell silent. This was the moment a husband would step forward. This was the moment a partner would wrap an arm around his wife's waist and correct the mistake with a laugh. I waited for it. I waited for Julian to say, "This is Sophia, my wife." Instead, Julian swirled the liquid in his glass, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Oh, Sophia is indispensable," he said, his voice carrying clear jazz music. "She is my high-end housekeeper, very expensive, high maintenance, but she keeps the sheets clean." The laughter that followed was a physical blow. It was sharp, jagged, and raucous. The men laughed because the alpha male had made a joke, and they needed to be in on it. The women nearby tittered behind their hands, their eyes scanning my off-the-rack dress with renewed judgment. I stood frozen, the silver tray trembling slightly in my hands. I felt the heat rising up my neck, a burning flush of humiliation that made my skin prickle. Julian did not look at me. He had already turned back to the red-faced investor, launching into a story about his golf swing. He had reduced my entire existence, my devotion, my silent support, to a punchline for a group of strangers. But the night did not end there. Later, As the moon rose high over the ocean and the guests became rowdier, the supply of vintage Dom Perignon ran dry. Julian was holding court by the pool. His tie loosened, his face flushed with alcohol and adoration. I approached him to whisper that the caterer had informed me we were out of the premium stock. Julian stopped mid-sentence. He looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and rage, as if I had personally drunk every bottle myself. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his black titanium credit card. He did not hand it to me. He flicked his wrist and threw it. The card spun through the air, catching the light before striking me squarely in the chest. It fell to the stone patio with a distinct, metallic clatter. "Useless," he muttered, loud enough for the inner circle to hear. "Go to the cellar. If we are out of the good stuff, drive to the liquor store in town. Buy the cheap stuff. Buy 5 cases of whatever costs $10. These idiots won't know the difference by now." He turned back to his guests, laughing. "She loves running errands. Give her a sense of purpose." I knelt down, in my simple navy dress, on the cold stone. I knelt at his feet to retrieve the credit card. I could feel the eyes of his secretary, a blonde woman named Jessica, who stood entirely too close to him, burning into my back. She was not laughing, she was pitying me, and that pity was far worse than the laughter. I picked up the card, the plastic worm from his pocket, and I walked away. I did not go to the liquor store. I went to the library, the one room in the house where Julian never set foot unless he wanted to take a staged photo for a magazine interview. The library was where the second memory, sharper and colder than the first, lay in wait. It had happened a month prior to the party, but the memory was inextricably linked to the humiliation in the Hamptons. It was the night I had finally gathered the courage to show him. I had spent 6 months drafting a business proposal. It was a strategy for diversifying Thorntech's assets, moving away from volatile cryptocurrency markets and into sustainable infrastructure bonds. It was brilliant. It was solid. It was the kind of plan that would have saved him from the cliff he was currently driving his company toward. I had printed it out, bound it in a simple black folder, and placed it on his desk. When I entered the room that night, Julian was standing by the fireplace, the folder in his hand. He was reading it, his brow furrowed. For a fleeting second, I felt a spark of hope. I thought, finally, he sees me. Finally, he sees that I am not just a decoration. Then, he chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Did you write this?" he asked, not looking up. "Yes," I answered, stepping forward. "I have been analyzing the market trends. Julian, your exposure to crypto is too high. If the regulatory commission steps in—" "Stop," he said. He didn't shout. He simply held up a hand. "Just stop." He walked over to the fireplace, where the logs were crackling with orange heat. With a casual, almost bored motion, he tossed the black folder into the flames. I gasped, rushing forward, but it was too late. The paper caught instantly. The edges curled and blackened. My charts, my graphs, my 6 months of work turning into gray ash and rising up the chimney. "Julian," I cried out, the shock robbing me of my breath. He turned to me, his expression flat. "Sophia, darling, look at you. You are getting wrinkles when you frown. Women like you should only think about beauty. That is your job. It looks pretty. Host parties, spend my money, but do not, ever, try to understand the world of giants. You are a small, fragile thing. Leave the thinking to the men who built this world." He patted my cheek, his palm hot from the fire. "Stick to your little online art classes. It's cute when you pretend to have a career." That was the moment something inside me fractured. But it did not break. It calcified. What Julian did not know, what his arrogance blinded him to, was that I was not taking art classes. I was not learning how to paint watercolors or arrange flowers. The thousands of dollars on the credit card statements labeled education and consulting were not for hobbies. They were fees paid to private investigators. They were subscriptions to global financial databases. They were payments for access to offshore banking registries in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. While he thought I was crying over a burnt business plan, I was tracking his IP addresses, while he thought I was shopping for shoes to soothe my ego. I was unraveling the complex web of shell companies he used to siphon money out of Thorntech. I knew about the consulting fees paid to a firm in Panama that didn't exist. I knew about the creative accounting Marcus Sterling used to hide losses from the shareholders. I knew that the giants Julian spoke of were actually standing on stilts made of fraud and debt. And I knew about Jessica. The final memory that solidified my resolve happened on my birthday, 2 weeks after the Hamptons party. I was alone in our penthouse in Manhattan. Julian had promised to be home for dinner. I cooked. I had set the table with the good silver. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Julian. "I'm not coming," he said. His voice was slurred. "Happy birthday to me," I whispered into the receiver. "Don't start," he snapped. "I am working. Unlike you, some of us have to earn the lifestyle you enjoy." In the background, I heard a giggle. It was high, breathless, and unmistakable. Then, a voice. Jessica's voice, muffled but audible. "Julian, come back to bed. The champagne is getting warm." Julian didn't even bother to cover the phone. "I have to go," he said to me. "Stop waiting up like a pathetic puppy. It's unattractive." The line went dead. I sat there in the silence of the multi-million-dollar apartment that felt more like a mausoleum. I looked at the cold food. I looked at the empty chair opposite me. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, hot and stinging, demanding to be shed. But I did not cry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the recording app. I had recorded the call. I had recorded the slur in his voice, the cruelty in his words, and the voice of his mistress in the background. I saved the file, naming it simply evidence_042. I stood up and cleared the table. I scraped the expensive steak into the trash. I washed the plates myself, the water scalding my hands, scrubbing away the illusion of our marriage. That night, the Sophia who wanted to be loved died. In her place, the Sophia who wanted justice was born. I realized then that Julian was right about one thing: I was a housekeeper, and I was about to clean the house. I snapped back to the present. The sterile light of the courtroom washing away the phantom warmth of the fireplace and the sting of the Hamptons air. Julian was still standing there, his chest heaving, his finger pointed at me, calling me a parasite. He thought he was insulting me. He thought he was exposing my weakness. But all he was doing was reminding me of the debt, every humiliation, every sneer, every burned page of my work, every dollar thrown at my chest. It was all recorded in the ledger. And unlike Julian, I never defaulted on a payment. I looked at him, and the memory of the pain did not make me flinch. It made me focus. The coldness that had started in the library that night had now spread through my veins, lowering my temperature, slowing my pulse, turning me into something reptilian and patient. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the weeping wife from the memories. She was gone. The woman sitting in front of him was the one who had picked up the credit card from the floor, not to spend it, but to trace the routing number. I adjusted my posture, straightening my spine against the hard wood of the chair. The ghost of the anniversary party faded, replaced by the sharp, undeniable reality of the trap I had set. Let him scream. Let him tell the world I was a housekeeper. He was about to find out just how effectively I could sweep him away. Julian did not stop at attacking my character. He needed to dismantle my present reality to feel truly superior. He signaled to Marcus, who projected an image onto the screen set up for the benefit of the court. It was a photograph of a dilapidated brownstone in a gritty section of Brooklyn, the kind of building where the bricks were crumbling and the fire escapes looked like rusted skeletons clinging to the facade for dear life. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice dropping to a register of mock sympathy that was far more insulting than his shouting. "Since our separation, while I have continued to maintain the marital residence to protect our assets, the defendant has moved here. Look at it. It is a squalid, rent-controlled apartment in a neighborhood where the police sirens never stop. This is where she belongs. This is the level of life she is capable of sustaining on her own merit. It is a slum." He turned to me, shaking his head with theatrical sadness. I offered her a settlement. I offered her enough to live in a decent studio in Queens. But her foolish, unearned pride refused it. Now she lives in filth, likely drowning in debt, unable to even afford a coat of paint for her front door. This, Your Honor, is proof of her financial incompetence. If she cannot manage a simple household budget, how can she claim any entitlement to the complex portfolio of Thorntech? I watched the image on the screen. It was a good photo. I should know, as I was the one who had hired the photographer to take it, though Julian would never know that. He believed his private investigator, a man who charged $200 an hour to sit in a car and eat donuts, had snapped it. The apartment in the picture was indeed a wreck. The address was real. The lease was in my name. The mailbox was stuffed with overdue notices for electric bills and final warnings from credit card companies. It was a masterpiece of set design, a physical manifestation of the narrative Julian wanted to believe. He needed me to be destitute. He needed me to be failing. It validated his ego to think that without him, I was nothing more than debris washing up on the shores of poverty. But I had never spent a single night in that apartment. The only time I had ever set foot inside was to sign the lease and to scatter a few cheap clothes around the bedroom to make it look inhabited in case anyone bribed the superintendent to let them in. The dust on the floorboards was real, but it was not my dust. The cockroaches that likely scurried in the walls were the only true tenants. The reality of my life was something Julian could not comprehend, because it existed in a stratosphere he had never been invited to enter, while he imagined me shivering in that drafty Brooklyn walk-up, heating cans of soup on a hot plate. I was actually residing in the penthouse of the Four Seasons under a corporate alias. My mornings did not begin with the sound of sirens. They began with encrypted video conferences with the finance ministers of G7 nations. Julian called me a housekeeper. He called me unemployed. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him, wearing a shirt with a frayed cuff, was the founder and majority shareholder of Valkyrie Dynamics. Valkyrie Dynamics was not a company you found on a Google search. We did not have a flashy website with stock photos of smiling people shaking hands. We did not have social media accounts. We did not advertise. If you knew the name Valkyrie Dynamics, it was because you were in trouble, the kind of trouble that could topple economies or dissolve sovereign governments. We were a global financial risk consulting firm, specializing in the acquisition and restructuring of distressed assets, toxic debt, and high-stakes corporate crisis management. When a tech giant in Silicon Valley was about to implode because of a hidden embezzlement scandal, they called Valkyrie. When a small European nation needed to restructure its national debt to avoid defaulting on World Bank loans, they called Valkyrie. My team was a phantom army of forensic accountants, former intelligence officers, and legal sharks who operated in the shadows of the global market. We fixed the messes that men like Julian created. Julian was proud of Thorntech. He bragged about his projected earnings, which usually hovered around $2 million a year if the market was kind, and if he didn't blow half of it on marketing stunts, he thought $2 million made him a god. I made $20 million last month alone. My monthly income was 10 times his annual profit, and that was a slow month. I sat there, listening to him describe the peeling paint of the Brooklyn apartment, and I felt a cold, hard amusement in my chest. It was almost funny. He was bragging about a $10,000 suit to a woman who had just closed a deal worth $500 million before breakfast, but I could not laugh. Not yet. The secrecy was not just for dramatic effect. It was a survival mechanism. I had hidden Valkyrie Dynamics from Julian for a very specific reason, and it wasn't just because he was arrogant. It was because he was dangerous. Not physically, Julian was too cowardly for violence, but financially. He was a gambler. He didn't play cards or roll dice in casinos. His addiction was far more destructive. He gambled on trends. He had a pathological need to be the next big thing. Over the years, I had watched him drain our joint accounts to fund insane ventures. There was the cryptocurrency that turned out to be a rug pull scheme. There was the investment in an electric yacht company that didn't have a working prototype. There was the real estate deal in Dubai that evaporated into the sand. Julian threw money at problems, believing that cash was a substitute for due diligence. If he had known about Valkyrie, if he had known that his housekeeper wife was sitting on a mountain of liquid capital, he would not have seen it as our security. He would have seen it as his bankroll. He would have guilted me, manipulated me, and eventually stolen from me to feed his insatiable hunger for validation. He would have poured my hard-earned millions into his sinkhole of an ego. Hiding my identity was the only way to protect the empire I had built. I had to let him believe I was nothing so that I could keep everything. I looked at the judge, then at Julian, and finally settled my gaze on Marcus Sterling. The lawyer was currently standing at the plaintiff's table, looking smug. He had just finished presenting the photos of the apartment and was now reaching for the next document in his stack. This was the moment. Before the trial began, my team at Valkyrie had legally intercepted the discovery documents. We had slipped in a few updates. They were perfectly legal, fully disclosed, and stamped by the appropriate regulatory bodies. But because Marcus was a lazy lawyer who relied on summaries written by paralegals, and because he was so confident in his victory over a helpless housewife, he hadn't bothered to read the full financial disclosure until this very morning. I watched his hand hover over the file. It was a thick document bound in blue plastic. It contained the updated asset evaluation of the marital estate. Julian was still talking, rambling on about how he hoped the court would order me to get psychiatric help so I could reintegrate into society as a productive member of the working class. "I just want her to be okay," Julian lied, placing a hand over his heart. "It breaks my heart to see her live in such squalor, but I cannot enable her laziness anymore. Tough love is what she needs." Marcus flipped the cover of the blue file. He turned the first page, then the second. I glanced at my watch. The Patek Philippe on my wrist was ticking softly. It was a vintage piece, a reference 1518 in steel, one of only 4 in existence. I had bought it at an auction in Geneva for a sum that would have made Julian vomit. He thought it was a knockoff I found at a flea market. He had even told me once to stop wearing it because it looked old and scratched. Tick, tick. Marcus turned to page 3. His brow furrowed slightly. He adjusted his glasses. He was looking at the list of liabilities for Thorn Tech. He was likely seeing a series of loan acquisitions that he didn't recognize. Tick, tick. He turned to page 4. This was where the list of creditors was detailed. He would be seeing a company name he didn't know, Valkyrie Dynamics. He probably thought it was just another vendor or a bank. He didn't know the name yet. He didn't know the fear it should inspire. Tick. Marcus turned to page 5. This was the page where the ownership structure of the creditor was revealed. This was the page where the beneficial owner was listed in black and white, mandated by federal transparency laws. I saw the moment it hit him. Marcus Sterling froze. His hand, which had been ready to flip to page 6, stopped in midair. His eyes widened behind his rimless glasses. He blinked. Once, twice, as if trying to clear a hallucination. He leaned closer to the paper, his nose almost touching the ink. The blood drained from his face so fast it was fascinating to watch, like a tide going out before a tsunami. He looked up. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at me. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The smug, oily confidence was gone, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who realizes he has brought a plastic knife to a nuclear war. I met his gaze. I didn't smile this time. I simply raised one eyebrow, a microscopic gesture that said, "Read it again. Marcus, make sure you spell my name right." Julian, oblivious to his lawyer's sudden catatonia, was still pontificating to the judge. "So, Your Honor, in light of her living conditions and her obvious inability to manage her own life, I ask that the prenuptial agreement be enforced strictly. No alimony, no division of assets, just a clean break." Marcus made a sound. It was a strangled, high-pitched squeak, like a mouse being stepped on. "Marcus," Julian asked, annoyed at the interruption, "give the judge the financial summary. Show her the debt Sophia has likely racked up." Marcus did not move. He was trembling. He looked at the document, then back at me, then down at the document again. He was realizing that the debt he was about to present wasn't mine. It was theirs. And the person holding the leash wasn't a bank. It was the woman sitting 10 feet away in a frayed shirt. The curtain was about to rise. My secret life as the CEO of Valkyrie Dynamics was no longer a shield to protect me. It was the sword I was about to swing. I uncrossed my legs and leaned forward slightly, mirroring the intensity of the judge. The slum in Brooklyn was 1,000 miles away. Here, in this courtroom, I was on my home turf. "Is there a problem, Mr. Sterling?" Judge Holloway asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. He looked at Julian, who was frowning in confusion. "Sir," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking so bad it was barely audible. We need to request a recess." "What? No," Julian barked. "Finish this. I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin at 12. "Sir," Marcus hissed, leaning in, his face pale as a sheet. "You don't understand. You need to look at page 5. I sat back. I checked my watch again. 10 minutes past 10, right on schedule. Julian was still talking. He was a runaway train of narcissism, fueled by the silence of the room, mistaking the stunned atmosphere for captivated agreement. He had moved on from my living conditions to my mental state, painting a portrait of a woman so fragile, so unhinged, that she needed the benevolent state to intervene. "She is delusional, Your Honor," Julian insisted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He paced back and forth, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. "I have found her staring at blank walls for hours. I have heard her muttering to herself in the middle of the night. She creates fantasies to cope with her lack of achievement. It is a classic case of dissociation. She cannot handle the reality of being the wife of a CEO, so she retreats into a shell of incompetence. I am not asking for punishment. I am asking for mercy. Grant the annulment. Give her a small stipend for psychiatric care, and let us end this charade." He paused for effect, turning his palms upward in a gesture of magnanimous pity. "I just want her to get help." Beside him, Marcus Sterling was disintegrating. It was a slow, agonizing process of structural failure. The lawyer who had strutted into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who owned the law was now gripping the edge of the defense table so hard that his knuckles were white. He had turned the page. He was staring at the document I had mentioned, the one stamped with the red seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I watched a bead of sweat detach itself from Marcus's hairline and slide down his temple. It navigated the terrain of his panic, bypassing his rimless glasses, and dripped onto the collar of his starch-stiff shirt. He was reading, and as he read, his world was ending. He saw the asset allocation. He saw the capital reserves. He saw the list of subsidiaries under the umbrella of Valkyrie Dynamics, and he saw the name of the primary shareholder. He looked at the document. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the document again, his eyes darting back and forth as if hoping the ink would rearrange itself into something less terrifying. "Julian," Marcus whispered. It was a hoarse, strangled sound. Julian ignored him. He was winding up for his closing statement on my insanity. "She has no concept of the value of $1. She thinks money grows on trees or appears by magic. She doesn't understand the pressure." "Julian, shut up," Marcus hissed, louder this time. He reached out and tugged violently on the sleeve of Julian's $10,000 suit jacket. Julian recoiled, slapping Marcus's hand away with a look of pure offense. "Do not touch me," Julian snapped, momentarily breaking his character of the grieving husband to reveal the petulant tyrant underneath. "I am speaking to the judge." He turned back to the bench, composing his face. "Forgive my counsel, Your Honor. He is clearly overwhelmed by the tragedy of this situation." Judge Beatrice Holloway was not looking at Julian. She was not looking at Marcus. She had removed her reading glasses and was holding them in her hand, tapping the earpiece rhythmically against the wood of her bench. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. She had the same blue file in front of her. Her clerk had handed it to her while Julian was describing my imaginary conversations with walls. She had been reading it while he spoke. The tapping stopped. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Holloway said. Her voice was not loud, but it had the weight of a falling anvil. It stopped the air in the room. Julian smiled, a sad, practiced smile. "Yes, Your Honor. I assume you are ready to rule on the motion for annulment." Judge Holloway leaned forward. The movement was predatory. She rested her elbows on the desk and laced her fingers together, staring down at him from the high bench. The reflection of the courtroom lights gleamed on the polished wood, but her eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "I have a question for you, Mr. Thorne," she said. "Anything, Your Honor," Julian replied, smoothing his tie. "I am an open book. Do you know who this woman is?" The question hung in the air, simple and confusing. Julian blinked. He looked at me, sitting silently at the defense table in my frayed shirt. And then he looked back at the judge. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "I beg your pardon," Julian asked. "Do I know who she is?" "Of course I do. She is Sophia Redmond, my wife, or rather, the woman I made the mistake of marrying 5 years ago." "Look closer," Judge Holloway said. Julian frowned. He turned his body fully toward me. He scanned me from head to toe, his eyes lingering on the scuffed tips of my shoes and the lack of jewelry on my hands. He saw what he expected to see. He saw a project that had failed. He saw a liability. "I see a woman who is lost," Julian said, turning back to the judge with renewed confidence. "I see a former librarian who couldn't handle the pressure of high society. I see an unemployed housewife who is currently living in a slum in Brooklyn because she is too proud to accept my charity. I see a person who has never signed the front of a paycheck, only the back of the ones I give her." He shrugged. "I know exactly who she is, Your Honor. She is a nobody." A sound came from the plaintiff's table. It was Marcus Sterling. He had slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He let out a low moan, the sound of a man who knew the executioner had just tested the rope. Judge Holloway did not blink. She reached out and picked up the document that Marcus had been staring at. She held it up. The paper crinkled in the silence. "Mr. Sterling seems to have found some reading material that disagrees with your assessment," the judge said dryly, "and I have a copy of the same document right here." Julian looked at his lawyer, finally noticing the state of catastrophic distress Marcus was in. "Marcus, what is the matter with you? Stand up." Marcus shook his head. He did not stand up. He couldn't. "Mr. Thorne," the judge continued, her voice hardening, losing all traces of judicial patience. "You have spent the last 45 minutes painting a picture of this woman as a financial illiterate. You have claimed she is a drain on your resources. You have claimed she is mentally unstable because she does not work." She rattled the paper in her hand. "This document is an authenticated filing from the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. It details the corporate structure and asset holdings of a private equity firm." Julian rolled his eyes. "What does that have to do with us?" "Sophia probably put some wrong papers in the discovery box. She is disorganized like that." "It has everything to do with you," Judge Holloway snapped, "because this is not a medical record. Mr. Thorne, it is not a bankruptcy filing. It is an investment portfolio." She looked at the document, reading from it with clear, precise diction. "The entity is listed as Valkyrie Dynamics, a global risk management and capital venture firm with holdings in 40 countries. Estimated valuation of current assets under management exceeds $3 billion. Julian froze. The number hung in the air. $3 billion. It was a number so large it didn't make sense in the context of his divorce hearing. He looked at me, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I don't understand," he stammered. "Why are you reading this? What is Valkyrie Dynamics?" "Valkyrie Dynamics," the judge said, lowering the paper slowly, "is the entity that holds the majority of the debt for half the technology sector in New York, and according to this sworn affidavit of ownership—" She paused. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and electric. "The founder, CEO, and sole beneficial owner of Valkyrie Dynamics is the woman sitting right there, Sophia Redmond." The silence that followed was not empty. It was violent. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. Julian looked at the judge. He looked at the paper. Then, slowly, painfully, his head turned toward me. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: disbelief, confusion, denial. He looked at my fraying shirt. He looked at my calm hands. He tried to reconcile the image of the wife he bullied with the concept of a billionaire CEO. The math didn't work in his head. It couldn't be true. If it were true, then everything he had said, everything he had done, every insult he had hurled for 5 years was not just wrong, it was suicidal. Julian's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. That's impossible. It's a mistake. A clerical error. There must be another Sophia Redmond. My Sophia. She clips coupons. She takes the subway. Mr. Sterling, the judge addressed the lawyer, who was still hiding his face in his hands. Can you confirm the authenticity of this document? Marcus slowly lowered his hands. His face was gray. He looked at Julian with the eyes of a man watching a car crash in slow motion. It is authentic, Your Honor, Marcus whispered. It is a certified 13F filing. The tax IDs match. The social security number matches. It is her. Julian staggered back a step, bumping into the railing. He looked at me as if I had just shed a human skin to reveal a dragon underneath. You, he breathed. You. I did not move. I did not speak. I sat with the absolute stillness of a predator that has no need to chase its prey. I let the silence stretch, taut and vibrate. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted physically. The air was no longer stale. It was charged with the ozone of a coming storm. The court reporter had stopped typing, her mouth slightly open. The bailiff was staring. The few people in the gallery were leaning forward, sensing blood in the water. All eyes were on me. For the first time in the entire hearing, I allowed my posture to change. I unclasped my hands. I sat back in the chair, crossing my legs with a fluidity and grace that belonged to the boardroom, not the kitchen. I raised my chin. My eyes met Julian's. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to scream like he did. My eyes were sharp, cold, and cutting. They were the eyes of the person who had approved the loans that kept his company afloat. They were the eyes of the person who knew exactly how much he had spent on dinners with his mistress, because I owned the bank that issued his credit card. I looked at him, and for the first time, he saw it. He saw the intelligence he had mistaken for silence. He saw the power he had mistaken for submission. Judge Holloway sat back in her chair, watching the tableau with grim satisfaction. It seems, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dry, that the embarrassment of New York society might not be who you think it is. Julian's mouth opened and closed, like a fish pulled from the water. He pointed a trembling finger at me. But the apartment, the Brooklyn apartment, it's a slum. An address, Mr. Thorne, I said. My voice was soft, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried like a bell. It was the first time I had spoken since the trial began. It is just an address, I continued, my tone level devoid of emotion. Just like a suit is just fabric, you of all people should know that packaging can be deceptive. You have been selling an empty box for years. I simply chose to wrap my substance in plain paper. Julian looked like he was having a stroke. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. You lied. You committed fraud. You hid assets. I protected assets, I corrected him calmly. From you. This is entrapment, he shouted, spinning back to the judge, desperation clawing at his throat. She tricked me. She set me up. I set nothing up, I said, my voice turning colder, sharper, like the edge of a razor. I simply let you be yourself. Julian, you did the rest. The judge cleared her throat, a sound that demanded order. Mr. Thorne, sit down. Your motion for annulment based on fraud is looking increasingly ill-advised. We are now going to proceed with the division of assets, and based on this new information, the scope of this hearing has changed significantly. Changed, Julian sputtered. She's rich. She has billions. She should pay me. I want half. I'm entitled to half." He was salivating now, the greed instantly overriding the shock. He saw the money. He didn't see the trap. He didn't see the teeth. I watched him, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. He thought he had just won the lottery. He didn't realize he had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy him completely. "Half," I repeated, tasting the word. I looked at Marcus Sterling. The lawyer met my eyes and shook his head slightly, a silent plea for mercy. He knew. He knew that if Julian asked for half of my empire, he was opening the door for me to audit every single penny of his. He knew that by invoking the equitable distribution of marital assets, Julian was inviting Valkyrie Dynamics to step out of the shadows and onto the balance sheet of Thorn Tech. "By all means," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "Let's talk about assets. Let's talk about ownership." I looked at the clock. The time for silence was over. The time for the harvest had begun. The revelation of my net worth hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. But Julian Thorn was a man possessed by a singular, indestructible delusion. His brain was frantically rewriting reality to protect his ego. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted, so he pivoted to the only ground he felt he still held: lifestyle. He smoothed the front of his jacket, forcing a sneer onto his face that looked brittle, as if it might crack and fall off at any moment. "Fine," Julian scoffed, waving a hand dismissively at the judge. "So she has money. Maybe she inherited it from a distant relative I didn't know about. Maybe she got lucky with a lottery ticket she didn't tell me about. It doesn't change the facts of how she lives. Look at her. She has no taste. She has no assets that matter. She is a renter." He turned to the gallery, finding his footing again in the mockery. "That is the difference between old money and whatever this is. I own my world. I own my penthouse. I own my headquarters. Sophia. She rents a hole in the wall because she has the mentality of a transient. She has no roots. She has no property. She is still, at her core, a woman who pays a landlord to put a roof over her head." I listened to him, and I felt a bubble of laughter rising in my throat. It wasn't hysterical laughter. It was the dark, rich amusement of a chess master watching an opponent move his king directly into a checkmate he didn't even see coming. I stood up. The motion was slow and fluid. The chair scrapped softly against the floor, a sound that seemed to silence Julian's rambling. I walked around the defense table. Moving into the open space in the center of the courtroom, I did not look at the judge. I looked directly at Julian. "You are right, Julian," I said, my voice conversational, as if we were discussing dinner plans rather than the dissection of his life. "I do not like renting. It feels so temporary. Why pay someone else's mortgage when you can build equity?" Julian rolled his eyes. "Spare us the philosophy. You live in a dump." "I did not say I lived there," I corrected him gently. "I said I leased it, but you brought up an interesting point about ownership, about your headquarters." Julian puffed out his chest. "Thorn Tech Tower, the jewel of the financial district, 40 stories of glass and steel, a symbol of innovation. I have a corner office on the top floor. The view alone is worth more than your entire existence." "It is a beautiful building," I agreed. 140,000 square feet of prime real estate, floor-to-ceiling windows, Italian marble in the lobby, and that delightful private elevator that goes directly from the garage to your office, so you never have to breathe the same air as your employees. "Exactly," Julian said, looking at the judge. "See, even she admits it. I built that company. I secured that location." "Actually," I said, taking a step closer to him, "you leased that location. Thorn Tech does not own the building. You signed a 10-year commercial lease 5 years ago. I remember because I proofread the contract while you were playing golf." "It is the same thing," Julian snapped. "It is a triple net lease. I am the primary tenant. It is my building in every way that matters." "It was," I said. The word hung there, past tense. Julian frowned. "What do you mean, was—" "I mean that the ownership of the building changed hands last Tuesday," I said. The previous owner, a lovely conglomerate based in Munich, decided to liquidate some of their North American assets. They put the building on the market quietly, pocket listing, very discreet. Julian laughed, but it sounded nervous. I would know if my building was sold. I am the CEO. They have to notify me. They did, I said. They sent a notification to the address on file for legal correspondence. That would be the P.O. box in Jersey City that you stopped checking 3 years ago because you fired your mailroom clerk to save money. I turned to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, if you would be so kind as to look at the supplementary evidence in the blue folder, Section C, Real Estate Holdings. The judge flipped to the section. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the deed transfer. The building located at 450 Broad Street, the judge read, sold for a sum of $210 million to a private equity trust. Who? Julian demanded. Who bought it? Some Chinese firm, the Saudis. The buyer is listed as SR Holdings, the judge said. Julian froze. He blinked. He mouthed the letters S.R. He looked at me. No, he whispered. No, that is a coincidence. SR implies Swiss Realty or Strategic Resources. SR, I said, spelling it out for him. Sophia Redmond. That is impossible, Julian shouted, his voice cracking. You cannot afford a skyscraper. You clip coupons for laundry detergent. I bought it with cash. Julian, I said, enjoying the way the color was draining from his face, leaving it a sickly, paste-like white. No mortgage, no financing, just a wire transfer. It took about 15 minutes. Liar. He turned to Marcus. Tell her she is lying. Check the registry. Marcus Sterling was already checking. He was furiously typing on his tablet, his fingers trembling so hard he kept hitting the wrong keys. After a moment, he stopped. He stared at the screen. He looked up at Julian, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated horror. Mr. Thorne, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. The deed was recorded 4 days ago. The purchasing entity is SR Holdings, LLC. The registered agent for the LLC is Valkyrie Dynamics. Julian staggered back as if he had been punched in the gut. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. You, he pointed a shaking finger at me. You are my landlord. Technically, I said, a cold smile playing on my lips. I am your landlord's boss, but yes, I own the roof over your head. Julian, I own the floor under your feet. I own the glass you look out of to feel superior to the world. I paused, letting the reality sink in. And as your new landlord, I have been reviewing the tenant agreements. Generally, I am a very hands-off owner. I like to keep good tenants happy, but I noticed some inefficiencies in the building's operations. Julian was breathing hard, his eyes wide and panicked. You can't kick me out. I have a lease. I have 5 years left. Oh, I am not kicking you out, I assured him. Not yet. I like the rent checks. Thorntech pays a premium for that location. However, I did make one small operational change effective this morning at 8 o'clock. I checked my watch. You probably didn't notice because you were too busy coming here to scream at me. But when you go back to the office, you might find your commute a little different. What did you do? Julian hissed. The private executive elevator, I said. The one with the gold-plated doors. The one you insist on using so you don't have to share space with the interns. I had the maintenance crew disable the keycard access for your specific badge. You what? I converted it into a service elevator, I continued, my voice dripping with sweet, poisonous honey. It is now exclusively for the janitorial staff and freight delivery. If you want to get to your office on the 40th floor, Julian, you will have to use the main bank of elevators. You know, the ones where the common people stand. You will have to wait in line. You will have to make small talk. You will have to smell their cheap coffee. You petty witch, Julian screamed. That is my elevator. It is in my contract. Actually, I said, turning to Marcus. Mr. Sterling, you negotiated that lease. Does the elevator clause specify that it is guaranteed in perpetuity? Or does it say it is a discretionary amenity subject to building management availability? Marcus closed his eyes. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. It is listed as a discretionary amenity. Mr. Thorne. See, I said to Julian, I am just exercising my discretion, and my discretion says that a man who calls his wife a parasite does not deserve a private lift. Julian looked like he was going to explode. The veins in his neck were bulging. I will sue you. I will withhold rent. I will move the company. Move. I raised an eyebrow. Move where? Julian, you have no cash reserves. Moving a headquarters of that size costs millions. You don't have millions. You have debt. And speaking of debt, I looked at Marcus again. Mr. Sterling, there is another clause in that commercial lease. Section 14, paragraph B. The change of control clause. I believe you are familiar with it. Marcus looked up, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He was realizing that he was the one who had drafted that contract 5 years ago, back when he thought he was protecting Julian from a hostile takeover by a competitor. He never imagined the hostile takeover would come from the wife. The change of control clause, Marcus stammered. Read it, I commanded softly. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice shaking. It states that, in the event the building is sold to a new entity, the new owner reserves the right to renegotiate all amenity fees and common area maintenance charges within 30 days of the sale. Exactly, I said. Common area maintenance charges, security, cleaning, lighting, HVAC. As of this morning, SR Holdings has recalculated the cost of maintaining the building standards to match the prestige of the new ownership. I smiled at Julian. Your rent is fixed, Julian, but your maintenance fees, I just tripled them. You will be receiving the invoice this afternoon. It is due upon receipt. Tripled, Julian shrieked. That will bankrupt us. We are already operating on thin margins. Then perhaps you should cut costs, I suggested. Maybe stop buying $10,000 suits, or maybe stop paying for a private elevator that you no longer have access to. Julian looked around the courtroom, his eyes wild. He looked at the judge, begging for intervention. Your Honor, she is squeezing me. This is vindictive. She is using her money to destroy my business. Judge Holloway looked down at him over the rim of her glasses. Her expression was completely unmoved. Mr. Thorne, the judge said coolly, you spent the last hour telling this court that Mrs. Redmond was a financial burden. You claimed she was a leech. Now that it has been revealed she is, in fact, a shark, you are complaining that she bites. She is abusing her power, Julian cried. She is exercising her property rights, the judge corrected. If you signed a lease with a discretionary amenity clause and a change of ownership provision, that is a failure of your legal due diligence, not a failure of her character. Welcome to the free market, Mr. Thorne. Julian slumped against the table. He looked small. The arrogance that had filled the room an hour ago had evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. He was standing in a building he didn't own, fighting a wife he didn't know, about money he didn't have. I don't believe it, he muttered, shaking his head. SAR Holdings, it can't be you. You don't know anything about real estate. You are just a housekeeper. I am a housekeeper who just cleaned out your lobby, I said. And Julian, I am just getting started. We haven't even discussed the parking garage yet. I sat back down, smoothing the fabric of my frayed shirt. It felt comfortable now. It felt like armor. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He wasn't just afraid of losing his money anymore. He was afraid of me. He was finally realizing that the woman he had treated like a piece of furniture was actually the architect of the room, and the walls were closing in. Marcus Sterling leaned over to Julian, his voice a desperate whisper that carried in the silent room. Sir, if she owns the building, she has access to the security logs, the visitor logs, the camera feeds. Julian's head snapped up. His face went from white to gray. I tapped my finger on the table. Oh, yes, the camera feeds. I have some very interesting footage from the late nights you spent in the office working on the merger. Jessica has a very distinctive walk, doesn't she? Julian made a sound like a dying animal. He looked at the exit, as if contemplating running, but there was nowhere to run. I owned the building he worked in. I owned the debt he owed. And in a few minutes, he would find out I owned a lot more than that. "Let's proceed," I said to the judge. "I believe Mr. Thorne was asking for half of my assets. I think we should calculate his net worth first, just to be fair." I smiled. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a lamb that had tied itself to the spit. "Shall we look at your liquidity, Julian?" The silence in the courtroom following my revelation about the building ownership was fragile. Like a sheet of glass vibrating under high frequency, it shattered the moment Julian Thorne's brain rebooted, rejecting the data it had just received. The cognitive dissonance was too great. In his world, I was the woman who ironed his shirts and clipped coupons for laundry detergent. In his world, he was the titan of industry. The idea that the power dynamic was not just inverted, but that he was essentially a tenant in my world, was physically painful for him to accept. So, he didn't. Instead, he exploded. "Lies!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. He slammed his fist onto the defense table, sending a pitcher of water wobbling dangerously. "This is all lies. She forged the deed. She forged the SEC filings, Your Honor. Are you going to let her make a mockery of this court with cheap photocopied fakes?" He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Where would she get the money, Tell me that. Where does a housewife get $210 million to buy a skyscraper? She doesn't unless she stole it." He looked at Marcus Sterling, grabbing the lawyer by the lapels of his jacket. "Marcus, do something. She has been siphoning money from me. That is it. She has been skimming from the household accounts. Maybe even hacking into the company reserves. That is the only explanation. She is an embezzler." Marcus tried to pull away, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the universe, perhaps even a black hole, rather than standing next to his client. "Julian, please, keep your voice down. The SEC documents are verified. You cannot forge a federal database entry." "I don't care about databases," Julian roared, pushing Marcus away. He turned back to Judge Holloway, his chest heaving. "I demand you arrest her. Right now, I want her in handcuffs. She is a criminal. She has committed grand larceny, fraud, identity theft. You cannot let her walk out of here. She is playing games with my money." The accusation hung in the air, grotesque and absurd. My money. He said it with such conviction, such possessive rage. It was the mantra he had repeated for 5 years. My money, my house, my company, my success. I watched him unravel. I watched the spit fly from his lips, the sweat staining the collar of his shirt, the desperate, manic glint in his eyes. It was pathetic. It was tragic. And it was deeply, darkly hilarious. A sound escaped my lips. It started as a low hum in my throat and bubbled up into a soft, audible chuckle. It was not a loud laugh, but in the tense silence of the courtroom, it sounded like a gunshot. Julian froze. He stared at me. For 5 years, he had only seen me smile politely, or look down in submission. He had never seen me laugh at him. To him, my laughter was blasphemy. "You think this is funny?" he hissed, stepping toward me, his hands balled into fists. "You think stealing my life is a joke?" I looked up at him, and I let the mask drop completely. I let the amusement fade, replaced by a look of profound, pitying clarity. "Your money," I repeated, tasting the words. "Julian, look at me, and listen very carefully." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You do not have any money. You have not had any money for 3 years. You have been broke since the winter of 2023. Julian recoiled as if I had slapped him. "That is insane. I am the CEO of Thorne Tech. They are valued at—" "You are valued on paper," I cut him off, my voice sharp and precise. "But liquidity cash. Actual, spendable wealth. You have been running on fumes and credit since the Omnicode lawsuit." The mention of the lawsuit hit him hard. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed immediately by a defensive wall slamming down. 3 years ago, Thorn Tech had been on the brink of total collapse. Julian, in his infinite arrogance, had borrowed a core piece of source code from a rival developer to rush a product to market. He thought he was being clever. He thought he wouldn't get caught, but he did. The lawsuit was swift, brutal, and terrifying. The legal fees alone were draining the company dry, and the settlement demand was astronomical. Thorn Tech was weeks away from declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The banks had frozen his lines of credit. The investors were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. I remembered those nights vividly. Julian would come home smelling of scotch and fear. He would pace the living room floor, ranting about how the world was against him, how nobody understood his genius. He never asked for my advice. He never asked for my help. He just used me as an audience for his self-pity. And then, the miracle happened, or at least, that was how Julian told the story. The lawsuit, Julian scoffed, regaining some of his bluster. That was a hiccup, a bump in the road, and I fixed it. I saved the company. He turned to the gallery, puffing out his chest, desperate to reclaim his narrative. She brings up ancient history because she wants to embarrass me. But the truth is, that was my finest hour. When everyone else panicked, I held firm. I went out there and I secured funding. I found a strategic partner who saw the potential of Thorn Tech when no one else did. He looked back at me, a sneer curling his lip. "You remember that, don't you, Sophia? You remember the night I came home with the champagne? You remember when I told you I had closed the deal of the century? I secured an injection of $20 million, cash, in the middle of a crisis. That is what a real businessman does. That is what talent looks like." He slammed his hand on his chest. "They invested in me. They invested in Julian Thorn because they knew I was a visionary. They didn't care about some frivolous lawsuit. They cared about the man at the helm. That $20 million saved the company. And it was all because of my reputation." He looked around the room, beaming with pride. He genuinely believed it. He had retold this lie to himself so many times that it had become his truth. He believed that some benevolent, shadowy group of super investors had looked at his failing, lawsuit-riddled company and decided that he was simply too brilliant to fail. I sat there, watching him preen. It was like watching a child brag about winning a game that his parents had let him win. $20 million, I said softly. "Yes, I remember the champagne. I remember you drinking the whole bottle and passing out on the rug while I cleaned up the glass you broke." I stood up again, slowly. "But you are confused about one thing. Julian, you think they invested in you." "They did," he shouted. "It was an angel investor, a private equity group. They scout talent." "They scout assets," I corrected him. "And they do not invest in talent that steals code. They invest in leverage." I walked over to the exhibit table where the thick blue folder lay open. I turned the pages until I found the document I was looking for. It was a copy of the financing agreement from 3 years ago, the one Julian had signed with a flourish, barely reading the fine print because he was so desperate for the cash to hit his account. "Do you recall the name of the angel investor? Julian?" I asked, holding the paper up. "It was a holding company," Julian said dismissively. "North Star Ventures. Something generic like that. Who cares? The check cleared." "North Star Ventures," I read from the document. "A wholly owned subsidiary of Valkyrie Dynamics." Julian stopped breathing. The air in the room seemed to follow suit. "No," he whispered. That is a coincidence." "There are no coincidences in finance, Julian," I said, my voice cold. "Only strategies. You see, 3 years ago, when you were drowning, when every bank in New York laughed in your face, I was the one sitting in the dark, looking at your books. I knew you were going to crash. And because we were married, your crash would have been my crash. Your bankruptcy would have exposed my finances to scrutiny I did not want. So I made a decision. I took a step closer to him. I decided to bail you out. But I did not do it as your wife. I did not do it as Sophia, the woman you told to buy cheap wine. I did it as Valkyrie. I authorized the transfer of $20 million from my private capital reserves to a shell company, which then lent it to you. Lent, Julian stammered. No, it was an investment. It was equity. I sold 10% of the company. I shook my head slowly, looking at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Read the contract. Julian, you didn't sell equity. You sold your soul. The agreement was structured as a senior secured loan with a convertible option. But the terms were predatory. I wrote them myself. I looked him dead in the eye. They didn't trust you. Julian, no one trusted you. The market knew you were a liability. The only reason that money appeared in your account is because you signed over everything as collateral. You put up the company, you put up the intellectual property, you put up the real estate lease, you even put up your personal assets. Julian's face was white. But I have been making payments. I have been paying the dividends. You have been paying interest, I said. Only interest. For 3 years. You have been treading water, servicing a debt that you have not reduced by a single cent. You celebrated that $20 million as a victory. You toasted to your genius, but in reality, you were just putting a collar around your own neck and handing me the leash. I gestured to the courtroom. You asked where I got the money. I got it from being smarter than you. I got it from betting against men who think their ego is a currency. I didn't steal your money. Julian, I saved you from prison. I saved you from the street. And instead of thanking the universe for the miracle, you spent the last 3 years strutting around like a peacock, spending my loan on suits and cars, and treating me like dirt. Julian looked at Marcus. Is this true? Marcus, tell me she is lying. Tell me it was an equity deal. Marcus Sterling was staring at the floor. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't look up. He just nodded. A small, jerky motion. It is a secured loan. Julian, Marcus whispered. I told you to read the appendix. You said you didn't have time. You said you just wanted the money. You idiot, Julian screamed at his lawyer. You let me sign that. You fired the last lawyer who tried to stop you, Marcus shouted back, his own panic finally breaking through. You told me to get the deal done or get out. You said you were a genius. I am a genius, Julian yelled, but the words sounded hollow now, echoing off the walls like a ghost in an empty house. A genius who is currently $20 million in debt to his ex-wife, I said calmly, plus interest, plus penalties, and Julian. We haven't even gotten to the best part of the contract yet. Julian looked at me, terror finally replacing the rage in his eyes. He realized he was standing on a trapdoor, and I had just put my hand on the lever. What? What do you mean? He stammered. I mean that the loan has covenants, I said. Rules, conditions, and you have broken almost all of them. But there is one specific clause that I think we need to discuss. It is my favorite. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, if we may proceed to Exhibit F, the loan agreement terms regarding default on character. Julian's eyes widened. He had no idea what that meant, but he knew, with a sinking certainty, that it was the end of him, the angel investor he had bragged about. The savior he had worshipped was the very woman he had dragged into court to humiliate, and she had not come to save him this time. She had come to collect. Judge Holloway reached for the next file on her bench with a deliberate slowness that suggested she was enjoying the unraveling of Julian Thorne's reality. It was a heavy, leather-bound folder, the kind used for significant corporate mergers, embossed with the seal of the court. She opened it, the spine cracking audibly in the silent room. Exhibit G, the judge announced, her voice devoid of the earlier irritation, replaced now by a clinical curiosity. The Angel Investment Agreement, dated November 14th, 2023. She looked over her glasses at Julian, who was still reeling from the revelation about the building but clinging desperately to the memory of his financial salvation. This contract was his holy grail. It was proof that someone, somewhere, valued him at $20 million. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, You stated earlier that this agreement was the turning point for your company. You claimed that a strategic partner saw your potential and intervened to save Thorn Tech from insolvency. Julian nodded, wiping a sheen of sweat from his upper lip. He straightened his tie, trying to regain the posture of the visionary CEO he believed himself to be. That is correct, Your Honor. It was a dark time, as I admitted, but talent attracts capital. That is the first rule of business. A firm called North Star Ventures approached me. They understood my vision. They knew that the lawsuit was just a temporary setback. They put up the capital because they wanted to be in business with Julian Thorn. North Star Ventures, the judge repeated, reading from the preamble of the contract. A Delaware limited liability company. She flipped a few pages, her finger tracing the lines of legal text. And here, in the definitions section, it lists the parent entity. She looked up. Valkyrie Dynamics. Julian nodded again, more vigorously this time. Yes, exactly. Valkyrie Dynamics, my strategic partner. They are a global powerhouse, very secretive, very exclusive. They don't just work with anyone. The fact that they chose me proves that my wife's assessment of my failure is objectively wrong. A multi-billion-dollar firm does not bet on losers, Your Honor. He shot a glance at me, a look of defiant triumph. He was thinking that even if I had money, even if I owned his building, I couldn't take this away from him. I couldn't take away the fact that an external, objective third party had validated his genius with a massive check. They are my partners, Julian insisted. We have a symbiotic relationship. A symbiotic relationship, the judge mused. That implies two different organisms working together, Mr. Thorn. She turned the document over to the very last page. The paper made a sharp, crisp sound as she smoothed it flat against the wood of her bench. Mr. Thorn, I would like you to look at the signature block for the investing entity, specifically, the line designated for the chairman of the board of Valkyrie Dynamics. Julian frowned, confused by the request. Why, it is just a signature. Probably some Swiss banker or a faceless suit. I never met the chairman personally. All the negotiations were done through intermediaries. That is how high-level finance works. Your Honor, the big dogs don't sit in the room until the deal is closed. Humor me, Judge Holloway said, turning the document around so it faced the defense table. She tapped her index finger on the black ink signature at the bottom of the page. Look closely. Julian leaned forward. He squinted. The courtroom was perfectly still. I could hear the hum of the HVAC system, the same system I had just tripled the price of. Julian stared at the signature. It was a distinct signature, elegant, sharp, with a peculiar loop on the capital S, and a sharp, descending slash on the R. It was a signature he had seen 1,000 times. He had seen it on our marriage license. He had seen it on the checks I wrote for the housekeeper he fired. He had seen it on the birthday cards I gave him, the ones he usually opened, glanced at, and tossed aside to look for the gift. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open, then snapped shut, then opened again. He blinked rapidly, as if his contact lenses were drying out. He looked at the signature, then up at me, then back at the signature. No, he whispered. It was a sound of pure denial. No. Is that familiar to you, Mr. Thorn? The judge asked. That looks like... He couldn't finish the sentence. The cognitive dissonance was short-circuiting his brain. It is the signature of Sophia Redmond, the judge stated, the chairman of Valkyrie Dynamics, the person who authorized the transfer of $20 million to your accounts. Julian staggered back, his legs hitting the chair behind him. He collapsed into it, not because he wanted to sit, but because his knees had ceased to function. You, he gasped, staring at me across the table. You were the investor. You were North Star. I stood up and walked slowly toward his table. I moved with the easy grace of a woman who owns the floor she is walking on. I stopped just a few feet from him, close enough to smell the expensive cologne that was now masking the scent of his fear. I am not just your wife, Julian, I said, my voice calm, precise, and echoing with authority. And I am not just your landlord. I am the shadow chairman of the board of Thorn Tech. Shadow chairman, he sputtered. There is no such position. I am the chairman. I am the CEO. You are the face, I corrected him. You are the mascot. But the person who controls the capital controls the company, and for the last 3 years, I have owned the capital. But the money, Julian stammered, his mind racing to find a loophole, a way out of the trap. $20 million. You said you made money, but that is a fortune. Where did you get that kind of liquidity? You don't have a job. You sit at home. I work from home, I said. There is a difference. I leaned against the edge of the defense table, crossing my arms. You asked where I got the money. I will tell you. While you were playing CEO, trying to steal code from teenagers to fix your broken software. I was working as a crisis consultant for the United States Department of the Treasury. Julian's eyes bulged. The Treasury, the government. Specifically, the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. I explained. I specialize in sovereign debt restructuring. When a developing nation is about to default on its loans, or when a sanction regime needs to be enforced through complex banking networks, they call me. I untangle the knots that politicians tie. I find money where there is none, and I freeze money where there is too much. I paused to let that sink in. 1 month of my consulting fees for a mid-sized European crisis is more than your company has grossed in its entire existence, I said. That $20 million? That wasn't my life savings. Julian, that was the bonus check from a job I did in Zurich, the same week you forgot our anniversary 3 years ago. Julian looked sick. The scale of the deception was crushing him. He had thought he was the sun, and I was a dim little moon reflecting his light. Now he realized he was just a candle, and I was a supernova. So, you invested in me, he asked, a tiny shred of hope returning to his voice. You used your own money to save the company that proves you care, that proves you believe in Thorn Tech. We are partners. I looked at him with a gaze that could have frozen mercury. I did not invest in you. Julian, I said. Investors look for growth. Investors look for potential. I saw neither. Then why, he cried, why give me the money? I didn't give it to you, I said. I used it to buy your debt. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, if you could explain the nature of a distressed asset acquisition to Mr. Thorn, I fear his understanding of finance is limited to spending money, not managing it. Judge Holloway looked down at the contract. The $20 million was not an equity purchase, Mr. Thorn. It was a purchase of liabilities. Valkyrie Dynamics bought out your previous loans from the banks that were about to foreclose on you. They consolidated your debt, and then they issued a new instrument, a high-yield, secured credit facility. I took over the narrative, stepping closer to Julian until I was looming over him. Do you understand what that means, Julian? I asked softly. It means I didn't buy shares in your success. I bought the rights to your failure. I don't understand, he whispered. When you buy equity, you are a partner, I explained, using the tone one might use with a slow child. You share the risk. If the company goes down, the partner goes down. I am not stupid enough to tie my fortune to a sinking ship like you. So, I bought the debt. I became your primary creditor. I walked around him, circling him like a shark. A creditor does not care if you have a bad quarter. I continued. A creditor does not care if your new product launch is a disaster. A creditor only cares about one thing: the terms of repayment. And because I bought the debt when you were radioactive, when no bank would touch you, I got to set the terms. And the terms gave me absolute priority. Priority? Julian asked weakly. It means I stand first in line, I said. Before the shareholders, before the employees, before the taxman, before you. If the company is sold, I get paid first. If the company goes bankrupt, I get the assets first. If the company makes a profit, I get the interest first. I stopped in front of him. You thought you had a silent partner. You didn't. You had a silent owner. Every chair in your office, every computer, every patent, every single paperclip in Thorn Tech. It is all collateral. It is all mine. You have just been borrowing it." Julian shook his head, tears of frustration and impotence welling in his eyes. "But why? Why hide it? Why not tell me?" "Because you are a gambler, Julian," I said, my voice filled with a cold, hard truth. "If you knew I had money, you would have stopped working. You would have drained my accounts to fund your fantasies. You would have bet it all on some crypto scam or a flying car startup. I had to keep the money separate to protect it from your incompetence. And I had to keep the debt secret to keep you working. I needed you to feel the pressure. I needed you to think you were answering to a ruthless corporate overlord." I smiled, a thin, sharp smile. "And you just didn't know she was the same woman who made your coffee in the morning." "This is evil," Julian whispered. "You let me sweat. You let me panic. You watched me beg for that money." "I watched you negotiate," I corrected. "And you negotiated poorly. You were so desperate to save your ego, so desperate to keep the title of CEO, that you signed a contract that gave Valkyrie Dynamics the right to seize control of the board if certain covenants were breached." "I haven't breached anything," Julian shouted, grasping at straws. "I paid the interest. I filed the reports." "You paid the financial interest," I agreed. "But money is not the only currency in a contract like this. There are behavioral covenants. There are morality clauses. There are stipulations about the conduct of the CEO. I pointed to the document in the judge's hand. Page 42, subsection C, the default on character clause. It is a standard clause in high-risk lending, usually reserved for volatile founders who might damage the investment with their personal behavior. Julian looked at Marcus. "Marcus, did you see this?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too busy reading page 42. His lips moving silently as he parsed the legal language that was about to act as a guillotine for his client's career. "You didn't read it," I said, answering for the lawyer. "You were too busy celebrating the $20 million. You didn't read the fine print that said the lender me could call the loan in full, immediately, if the borrower engaged in public acts of defamation, slander, or reputational self-destruction." I looked around the courtroom. "And Julian screaming in a court of law that your wife, who is also your primary creditor, is a parasite and a mental case. That is definitely reputational self-destruction." "You trapped me," Julian hissed. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "You just kicked the chair away, Julian." The realization hit him, the weight of the 3 years, the $20 million, the building, the lies. It all came crashing down at once. He wasn't fighting a divorce case anymore. He was fighting for his financial life against an opponent who had already bought the battlefield 3 years ago. "So," I said, stepping back and addressing the court in a loud, clear voice, "since Mr. Thorne has confirmed that Valkyrie Dynamics is his strategic partner, and since the court has established that I am Valkyrie Dynamics, I believe we can move past the who has the money portion of this trial. The answer is, I do. All of it." I looked at the judge. "I am ready to discuss the repayment schedule. Your Honor, the loan is now due." Julian panic is a specific scent. It is not the musk of honest fear, which is primal and understandable. It is the acrid chemical smell of entitlement burning to ash. He spun around to face Marcus Sterling, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. "This is illegal," Julian shouted, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. He was grasping for a lifeline, any lifeline, and he had decided that the law, the very thing he had just tried to use to annul our marriage, must somehow protect him from the consequences of his own contracts. "Marcus, tell her. Tell the judge. A wife cannot secretly lend money to her husband's company under a shell corporation. It is a conflict of interest. It is insider trading. It is a breach of fiduciary duty." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "She entrapped me. She cannot be my wife and my creditor at the same time. The law does not allow it. It is a violation of the marital trust." I watched him flail. It was fascinating to see how quickly he invoked the sanctity of marriage when it suited his bank account, mere minutes after describing our union as a fraud. "Actually, Julian," I cut in, my voice slicing through his hysteria with surgical precision. The law allows exactly that. And do you know why? I walked back to the defense table and picked up a document that had been sitting there since the beginning of the trial. It was not a secret financial filing. It was a document Julian knew very well. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, holding it up. Julian squinted. That is the prenuptial agreement." "Correct," I said. "The ironclad prenuptial agreement, the one you insisted we sign, the one you had drafted by 3 different firms to ensure that not a single penny of your precious empire would ever touch my hands. You were so terrified that I was a gold digger that you created a legal wall between us." I opened the document to the first section. Article 1, Section 4. Separation of financial identities. It states, quite clearly, that both parties retain the right to conduct independent business operations, acquire assets, and enter into contracts as sole proprietors. Without the consent or knowledge of the other spouse, it explicitly waives any claim of conflict of interest regarding business dealings between the parties' separate estates. I looked at him over the top of the paper. "You wrote this clause, Julian. You told me it was to protect me, in case your risky genius ever got you sued. You said you didn't want my little savings account to be dragged into your corporate battles, but the legal reality is that you established us as 2 completely separate economic entities. In the eyes of the law, when Valkyrie Dynamics lent money to Thorn Tech, it wasn't a wife lending to a husband, it was an arm's-length transaction between 2 corporations. The fact that we shared a bed is legally irrelevant to the fact that you signed a promissory note." Julian looked at Marcus. "Is she right? Can she do that?" Marcus Sterling did not look good. He had abandoned his tablet and was now rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away a migraine that threatened to split his skull. "Technically, yes, the prenup acts as a firewall. It validates her independent status. If Valkyrie Dynamics is a registered entity, and Thorn Tech is a registered entity, the relationship is corporate, not matrimonial." "Thank you, Marcus," I said. I turned back to Julian. "So, let's put aside the hysterical notion that this is illegal. It is perfectly legal. It is binding. And now, we need to talk about the nature of that $20 million, because you seem to be laboring under a delusion that we are partners." I gestured to the judge, who was watching the proceedings with the intense focus of a hawk watching a field mouse. "Your Honor, Mr. Thorne keeps using the word investor. He believes I bought equity. He believes I own shares. He thinks that if the company fails, I will lose my money just like he does. I need to correct this misunderstanding." I walked over to the large easel that had been set up for Julian's earlier presentation about my spending habits. I flipped the page, covering his charts, and picked up a marker. "Julian," I said, writing the number 20 million on the blank page, "when you took this money, you were desperate. You didn't care about the structure. You just wanted the cash. But the structure matters. I did not buy stock. I did not buy a piece of the pie." I wrote 3 words in large, capital letters, "Senior secured loan." "I bought the plate the pie is sitting on," I said. Julian stared at the words. "What does that mean?" "It is just financial jargon." "It is the difference between life and death," I said. "In the hierarchy of capital, equity is at the bottom. Shareholders, that is you, Julian, are the last to get paid. If the company goes under, shareholders get nothing. They are the ones who take the risk." I drew a line above the word equity and wrote debt. "Creditors are above shareholders," I explained. "We get paid before you see a dime, but not all creditors are created equal. There are unsecured creditors. Like the vendors you haven't paid for the office snacks, there are junior bondholders." I drew another line at the very top of the pyramid. "And then, there is me, the senior secured lender. Do you know what secured means, Julian?" He didn't answer. He was pale, his eyes fixed on the diagram. "It means the loan is backed by hard assets," I said, answering for him. "It means that $20 million is not a bet on your future. It is a lie on your present. It means that legally, I have a claim on everything Thorn Tech owns, the intellectual property, the servers, the brand trademarks. the inventory, even the ergonomic chair you are so fond of. I capped the marker with a sharp click. I do not own your company, Julian. That implies I have to care about its operations. I own your debt, and in the world of finance, the person who owns the debt owns the person who borrowed it. Julian shook his head, a drop of sweat flying from his forehead. So what? So I owe you money. Companies have debt all the time. It is standard. As long as I pay the interest. You can't touch me. You can't take the company away just because you lent me money. That brings us to the concept of priority, I said, and the concept of insolvency. I turned to Marcus. Mr. Sterling, you are a lawyer. Tell your client what happens when a company becomes technically insolvent, or when it breaches a loan covenant held by a senior secured lender. Marcus stared at the table. He picked up his expensive fountain pen, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. He looked like a man who was calculating the exact moment his career had ended. Marcus, Julian barked. Answer her. Tell her she is powerless as long as I write the checks. Marcus took a deep breath. He looked up at Julian, and there was no deference left in his eyes, only a hollow resignation. She is not powerless, Julian, Marcus said quietly. She is the only one with power. What are you saying? I am saying that in a senior secured facility, Marcus explained, his voice flat, reciting the eulogy of Thorn Tech. The lender has the right to step in. If the covenants are breached, or if the lender declares a default, the ownership of the collateral reverts to the lender. They don't have to sue you. They don't have to wait for a bankruptcy judge. They can simply foreclose. They can appoint a receiver. They can liquidate the assets to satisfy the debt. Marcus looked at me, then back at Julian. She doesn't have to ask the board for permission. Julian, if she calls the loan, and you cannot pay the full $20 million plus penalties immediately, she takes everything. She takes the code. She takes the patents. She takes the company, and you. As the equity holder. You get wiped out. You get zero. Marcus's fingers went slack. The fountain pen slipped from his grasp. It hit the wooden table with a sharp clatter and rolled off the edge, falling to the floor. My God, Marcus whispered, the realization finally hitting the bottom of his stomach. She holds the handle. We are holding the blade. The silence that followed was absolute. The image of the pen rolling across the floor seemed to replay in everyone's mind. It was the symbol of Julian's control slipping away. But Julian was not ready to die. He was a creature of immense, stubborn denial. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white. No, Julian said, shaking his head violently. No, that is theoretical. That is only if I default, and I have not defaulted. He looked at me with a desperate, manic grin. You are trying to scare me. You are trying to bluff me into a settlement, but I know the math. Sophia, I have paid every interest payment on time. Every single month. For 3 years. The automatic transfer goes from Thorn Tech to North Star Ventures. I have never missed a payment. Not one. He turned to the judge, pointing at the financial records. Check the logs. The payments are there. I am a model borrower, as long as I service the debt. The loan is in good standing. She cannot call a loan that is performing, that is predatory, that is illegal. He laughed, a high-pitched, jagged sound. You thought you had me. You thought I would slip up. I am meticulous with money. Sophia, I pay my debts. You can't touch the collateral because I haven't given you a reason to. I watched him celebrate his survival. He really believed it. He believed that writing a check every month bought him immunity. He believed that the contract was a shield, not a sword. He had forgotten the most dangerous part of any contract, the behavior clauses. You are right, Julian, I said softly. You have paid the financial interest. You have been very diligent about sending me $200,000 a month. I used it to buy my shoes. Thank you. I took a step closer, my voice dropping an octave, becoming harder, colder. But a loan agreement is not just about money. It is about faith. It is about the lender's confidence in the borrower's ability to lead. and there are other ways to default than just missing a payment. I picked up the loan agreement again. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew every word by heart. I had written them at 3 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table while Julian slept, dreaming of his greatness. "You really didn't read Section 15, did you?" I asked. "I read enough," Julian snapped. "It is a standard boilerplate force majeure. Acts of God, bankruptcy, none of that applies. Section 15, paragraph B," I recited from memory, "the default on character clause, or as we call it in the industry, the bad boy guarantee." Julian frowned. "What?" "It is a clause designed to protect the lender from a borrower who becomes a liability to the asset," I explained. "It states that the loan enters immediate default if the principal, that is you, Julian, engages in conduct that is publicly detrimental to the reputation of the lender or creates a hostile legal environment that jeopardizes the lender's security interest." I smiled. "You see, Julian, when you signed this, you didn't know who the lender was. You thought North Star Ventures was just a faceless fund. You didn't know that by attacking your wife. You were attacking your bank." That doesn't mean anything," Julian stammered, but his eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit. "It means everything," I said. "This morning, in this courtroom, on the public record, before a judge and a court reporter, you accused the beneficial owner of your debt of being mentally unstable. You called me a fraud. You called me a parasite. You accused me of embezzlement." I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, does the court record reflect that Mr. Thorne accused the chairman of Valkyrie Dynamics of grand larceny?" "The record reflects it," Judge Holloway said, her voice dry. I turned back to Julian. "You just committed defamation against your primary creditor. You just publicly slandered the entity that holds your mortgage. In any other industry, that would be bad. But in high finance, that is suicide." I tapped the table with my finger. "You claimed you paid your interest, so you are safe, but the contract says that in the event of a character default, the acceleration clause is triggered automatically. Do you know what acceleration means?" Julian. He didn't answer. He couldn't breathe. "It means the timeline vanishes," I said. "Does it mean the 5-year term you thought you had? It is gone. It means you don't owe me $200,000 for this month. It means you owe me the full principal, the entire $20 million, right now." You can't," Julian whispered. "I can," I said, "and I am." I looked at Marcus Sterling, whose face was buried in his hands again. "Mr. Sterling," I said pleasantly, "please inform your client that the grace period has just expired." Julian looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see his wife. He didn't see the housekeeper. He saw the institution of banking itself. Cold, indifferent, and absolute, standing in a frayed shirt, waiting to collect. I don't have $20 million. Julian choked out. "You know I don't. It is all tied up in the stock. It is in real estate." "The real estate I own," I asked, "and the stock that is pledged to me as collateral." I shook my head. "That is unfortunate, Julian, because if you cannot pay cash, I am afraid I have to exercise my rights under the security agreement." I looked at the clock. It was time. "I am calling the loan, Julian, and since you are insolvent, I am taking the company." I tapped my index finger on the mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was small, rhythmic, and incredibly precise. In the cavernous silence of the courtroom, it echoed like the ticking of a bomb that had reached its final second. Julian was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under the $10,000 suit that was now damp with sweat. He was clinging to the wreckage of his argument, the idea that his diligent interest payments protected him from my wrath. He believed that as long as he wrote the check, he was safe. He believed that money was the only language the contract spoke. He was wrong. Contracts speak the language of behavior, and he had been screaming profanities in that language for the last 90 minutes. "You mentioned you are a model borrower." "Julian," I said, my voice soft but carrying a weight that pressed down on the room. "You said you have never missed a payment. You said you are in good standing. I stopped tapping. I looked him dead in the eye. Have you ever actually read Section 15, Clause B of the loan agreement? Julian blinked, a bead of sweat dripping into his eye. He rubbed it away angrily. I told you. I read the important parts. The interest rate. The maturity date. Section 15 is just legal filler. It is standard boilerplate about bankruptcy and insolvency. No, I corrected him gently. Section 14 is bankruptcy. Section 15 is the moral hazard and conduct covenant. I walked over to the witness stand, where I had left the blue folder. I picked it up and walked back to Julian, holding it out like a hymnal in a church of judgment. Read it, I commanded. Julian looked at the paper. He looked at Marcus Sterling. Marcus was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Julian snatched the folder from my hand, his movements jerky and aggressive. He scanned the page, his eyes darting back and forth. I don't see anything, he muttered. Just words. Material adverse effect. Preservation of collateral. Keep going, I said. Clause B. The paragraph titled, Defamation and Hostile Acts Against Lender. Julian found it. I saw his eyes stop moving. I saw his lips part slightly. I saw the color drain from his face, leaving it the color of old ash. Read it aloud. Julian, I said, for the court record. He swallowed hard. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. It says... Loudly, I said. It says... Julian's voice trembled. In the event that the borrower, or any principal agent of the borrower, engages in public acts of defamation, slander, libel, or malicious verbal assault against the lender's representatives, or the lender's beneficial owners. He stopped. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide with a dawn of horrific understanding. Keep reading, I whispered. Then such acts shall constitute an immediate event of default. Julian read, his voice barely a whisper. The lender reserves the right to declare the entire principal balance, along with all accrued interest and applicable penalty fees, immediately due and payable. The lender may, at their sole discretion, bypass standard cure periods and proceed directly to asset seizure. He lowered the paper slowly. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Immediate event of default, I repeated. Do you know what that means in plain English? Julian. He didn't answer. He couldn't. It means that if you insult the bank calls the loan, I said. And as we have established, Julian, I am the bank. I turned away from him and faced Judge Holloway. I stood tall, smoothing the front of my frayed shirt. I was no longer the defendant. I was the plaintiff. I was the prosecutor. I was the sword of Damocles that had just snapped its thread. Your Honor, I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative, I would like to call the court's attention to the events of this morning. Specifically, the opening statement made by Mr. Julian Thorne. The judge nodded slowly, her face grim. I am listening, Ms. Redmond. At approximately 9:15 this morning, I began, checking my watch as if confirming a train schedule. Mr. Thorne stood in this courtroom, on the public record, and referred to me as a mental case. Is that correct? The record reflects that, the judge confirmed. He also referred to me as a parasite, I continued, ticking the insults off on my fingers. He called me an embarrassment to society. He called me a fraud, and perhaps most damaging of all, he accused me, the beneficial owner of his company's debt, of the crime of embezzlement and grand larceny without a shred of evidence. I turned back to Julian. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles looked like they were about to burst through the skin. Section 15. Clause B is very specific. Julian, I said. It protects the lender from reputational damage caused by an unstable borrower, by screaming those insults in a court of law. You have publicly attacked the integrity of your primary creditor. You have questioned my sanity. You have questioned my honesty. You have tried to destroy my character. I took a step closer to him. You thought you were just humiliating your wife, I said coldly. But you were actually breaching your contract with Valkyrie Dynamics. You triggered the default on character clause, and you did it 5 times in under an hour. I looked at Marcus Sterling. Mr. Sterling, as legal counsel for the borrower, do you dispute that your client's statements today constitute a hostile verbal assault under the definition of the agreement? Marcus looked up. He looked like a man who had been adrift at sea for weeks. He shook his head slowly. No, he whispered. The language is clear. Public defamation of the beneficial owner is a trigger event. He said the words. Thank you, I said. I turned back to Julian. The trap was fully sprung. The steel jaws were clamped tight around his leg, and now I was going to pull. So, I said, my voice businesslike and brisk, since we have established a breach of Section 15, I am officially exercising my rights under the acceleration clause. I extended my hand, palm up. I am calling the loan, Julian. Julian stared at my hand. What? I am terminating the credit facility, I explained. The installment plan is over. The monthly interest payments are over. The 5-year timeline is over. It is all over. I took a breath, letting the magnitude of the number fill the room. You owe me $20 million, I said, plus the 3 years of accrued interest that was deferred to the back end, plus the early termination penalty fee of 5%, plus the legal fees for this enforcement action. I did the mental math in a split second. That comes to approximately $24,350,000, I said, and I want it now. Julian looked at me as if I had asked him to produce a live dinosaur. Now, what do you mean? Now. I mean now, I said. Today, before the market closes, before you leave this building, I want a wire transfer for $24 million hitting the Valkyrie Dynamics account by 4 o'clock this afternoon. That is impossible, Julian shrieked. The sound tore out of his throat, ragged and terrified. I don't have $24 million in cash. You know I don't. No one keeps that kind of cash liquid. It is all in the company. I know, I said calmly. That is the problem with being insolvent. Julian, you are asset rich and cash poor. Actually, you are just asset poor now. You can't do this, he pleaded, turning to the judge. Your Honor, she is asking for the impossible. She knows I can't pay that today. This is extortion. It is a contract, Judge Holloway said, her voice cutting through his panic like a knife. You signed it. Mr. Thorne, you agreed that if you defamed the lender, the full amount would be due. You spent the morning defaming the lender. You made your bed. Now you are finding it quite uncomfortable to lie in. Julian looked back at me, his eyes wild. Sophia, please, be reasonable. I can't pay you today. Give me time. Give me a month. I can sell some stock. I can liquidate some positions. You can't sell the stock, I reminded him. The stock is pledged to me as collateral. You can't sell what you don't own free and clear. You need my permission to sell the shares, and I do not give it. Then what do you want me to do? He screamed. If I can't sell the stock, and I don't have the cash, how am I supposed to pay you? That is a very good question, I said. Usually, when a borrower cannot meet a margin call or a debt acceleration, they have one option left. I looked at the easel where I had drawn the pyramid of debt. I pointed to the word collateral. You surrender the asset, I said. Julian froze. Surrender, you mean the company? I mean everything, I said. Thorne Tech, the intellectual property, the patents, the brand, the office furniture, the lease on the building I already own, and by your personal assets that were listed as secondary security. I pulled out the last page of the loan agreement. You pledged your personal real estate portfolio, I said. That includes the penthouse on Park Avenue. You pledged your personal vehicle collection. That includes the Ferrari you drove here today. You pledged your art collection. That includes the Basquiat you bought last year to impress your friends. I looked at him with a cold, devastating finality. You don't have $24 million, Julian, but you have things that are worth $24 million, and since you cannot write me a check, I am going to take the things. No, Julian whispered. He was backing away from the table, shaking his head. "No, you can't take my company. It is my life. It is my name on the door. It is Thorn Tech." "It is a name," I said. "And names can be changed. I was thinking of rebranding it. Maybe Redmond Analytics. It has a nice ring to it. Don't you think?" "You are stealing it," he shouted. "You are stealing my legacy." "I am foreclosing on my property," I said. "There is a difference." I turned to Marcus Sterling. The lawyer was sitting perfectly still, staring at the wall. He had accepted his fate. He knew the legal mechanics were sound. He knew there was no defense. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "does your client have $24 million in liquid funds available to transfer immediately?" Marcus cleared his throat. "No, Ms. Redmond, he does not." "Does he have access to third-party financing to cover the debt?" "No," Marcus said softly. "His credit rating is leverage to the hilt. No bank will lend to him with a senior lien already in place." "So," I said, "we are in a state of incurable default." "Yes," Marcus whispered. "We are—" I turned back to Julian. He was trembling violently now. The reality was crashing down on him. He wasn't just losing the divorce. He wasn't just losing half. He was losing everything. He was going to walk out of this courtroom with nothing but the $10,000 suit on his back. And frankly, if I wanted to be petty, I could probably repossess that too, since he likely put it on the company credit card. "You did this," Julian hissed. His eyes filled with a toxic mix of hate and tears. "You planned this. You waited for me to insult you. You baited me." I sat in silence. I corrected him. "I didn't say a word for an hour. You were the one who couldn't stop talking. You were the one who needed to brag. You were the one who needed to hurt me. All I did was hand you the shovel. Julian, you are the one who dug the grave." I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:30. "You have been in default for 15 minutes, I said. "I am done waiting." I looked at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, "the borrower is insolvent. The debt is accelerated and unpaid. I am formally requesting a writ of execution and an order of seizure for all pledged collateral, effective immediately." "Marcus," Julian screamed, grabbing his lawyer's arm. "Stop her, object, do something." Marcus looked at Julian with dead eyes. He pulled his arm away, slowly and deliberately. "There is nothing to object to, Julian," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "You signed the contract. You insulted the lender. You have no money. It is over." "It is not over," Julian roared. "I am Julian Thorn. I am a visionary. I am not going to let a housewife take my company." He looked around the room, frantic, searching for an escape, searching for a camera, searching for someone who would believe his version of reality. But there was only the silent, wood-paneled room, the stern face of the judge, and me. I stood there, calm and immovable. I was the wall he had run into at full speed. "It is over, Julian," I said softly. "The only thing left to decide is if you want to walk out of here with your dignity, or if you want security to drag you out." I checked my watch again. "Tick-tock," I said. "The interest is compounding every second." The transition was instantaneous and grotesque. The moment the reality of the accelerated debt settled upon Julian Thorn, the titan of industry vanished, replaced by a creature of desperate, shivering instinct. He did not look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man who had been stripped naked in a blizzard. The arrogance that had fueled him for the last hour, the sneering confidence that had led him to call me a mental case, evaporated into a mist of pure terror. "Sophia, wait," Julian stammered, his hands shaking as he reached across the table, palms up in a universal gesture of begging. "Wait, we can work this out. Please, you can't do this. You can't just take everything. Think about what you're doing. Think about us." "Sss," I asked, my voice flat. "There is no us. Julian. There is a plaintiff and a defendant. There is a lender and a borrower in default. The entity known as us was dissolved the moment you threw a credit card at my face in the Hamptons." "I am sorry," he cried out, the words tumbling over each other. "I am sorry about the Hamptons. I am sorry about the credit card. I was drunk. I was stressed. I didn't mean it. I will make it up to you. I will go to therapy. I will fire Jessica. I will do anything. Just don't take the company. Please, Sophia. That is all I have." He was bargaining now, offering up scraps of promises that he had no intention of keeping. It was the frantic negotiation of a man who realizes he has no leverage left. He was trying to sell me a future that he had already bankrupted in the past. "You don't understand," I said, looking down at him with the detached clinical interest of a surgeon observing a necrotic limb. "Your apologies have no market value. Julian, you are trying to pay a $24 million debt with emotional currency that is counterfeit. I don't want your therapy. I don't want your promises. I want my capital." "I will pay you," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I will work for you. Keep me on as CEO. I will run the company for you. I will earn the money back. I know the business better than anyone. You need me." "I don't need you," I replied. "I never needed you. That was your biggest mistake. You thought you were the engine, but you were just the hood ornament. And frankly, you are looking a little tarnished." I turned my back on him, facing the bench. "Your Honor, the borrower is bargaining with assets he does not possess. I renew my request for the immediate execution of the seizure order." Judge Holloway looked at Julian. There was no pity in her eyes, only the stern resolve of the law. She raised her gavel. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, "you have admitted on the record that you cannot satisfy the debt. You have admitted default. The contract is clear. The acceleration clause is valid." She brought the gavel down. It made a sharp, wooden crack that sounded like the breaking of a spine. "The court finds in favor of the creditor, Valkyrie Dynamics. The motion for immediate asset seizure is granted. The court orders the full forfeiture of all collateral listed in the security agreement to satisfy the outstanding principal and penalties." The sound of the gavel seemed to snap something inside Julian's brain. The begging ceased. The pathetic whining vanished. In its place, a feral, cornered rage surged forward. He realized that the charm, the lies, and the manipulation had all failed. He had nothing left but violence. "No!" Julian roared. It was a primal sound, deep and ugly. "You witch! You thief! You are not taking my company." He lunged. He scrambled over the defense table, scattering papers and water pitchers, his eyes fixed on my throat. His face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred, his $10,000 suit straining at the seams as he reached for me. "I will kill you," he screamed. "I will kill you before I let you win." I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched him come. But he never reached me. Two bailiffs, who had been edging closer ever since Julian started screaming, moved with professional speed. One of them caught Julian in midair, tackling him around the waist. The other grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. They slammed him down onto the defense table, pressing his face against the polished wood. "Get off me!" Julian shrieked, struggling against the weight of the officers. "Do you know who I am? I am Julian Thorne. I am a CEO." "You are a debtor in default," the bailiff grunted, tightening his grip. "Stay down." Marcus Sterling stood up, backing away from the chaos, holding his hands up as if to physically distance himself from his client's insanity. He looked at me, his face pale. I had no part in this violence, Ms. Redmond. I am withdrawing as counsel effective immediately." "Noted, Mr. Sterling," I said calmly. I looked down at Julian. His cheek was smashed against the table, his expensive tie skewed, his hair a mess. He was panting, glaring up at me with one wild eye. "You planned this," he hissed, spitting saliva onto the wood. "You wanted to humiliate me." "I wanted to be paid," I corrected him. "The humiliation was a bonus you provided yourself." I walked over to the court clerk's desk. The clerk, a young woman who looked thoroughly shaken by the outburst, handed me a stack of documents. These were the execution orders, the transfer of deeds, the assignment of stock. I took a gold pen from my pocket. It was heavy and cool to the touch. "Let's make this official," I said. I signed the first page. It was the deed transfer for the penthouse on Park Avenue, the home where Julian had thrown his parties, where he had brought his mistress, where he had made me sleep in the guest room when he was working late. Sophia Redmond. The signature flowed onto the page. With that ink, the locks would be changed within the hour. The security codes would be wiped. His clothes, his art, his wine collection, they were now the property of SR Holdings. I flipped to the second page. The title transfer for the Ferrari and the vintage Porsche he kept in the garage. Sophia Redmond. He loved those cars more than he had ever loved a human being. Now, they were just inventory. I would probably have them auctioned off by the end of the week. I flipped to the third page, the big one, the assignment of control for Thorn Tech. This document transferred 100% of the voting shares, the intellectual property rights, and the board seats to Valkyrie Dynamics. I paused for a fraction of a second. I looked at the name Thorn Tech printed at the top of the page. It was his name. It was his identity. It was the only thing that made him feel like he existed. I signed my name over his. Sophia Redmond. It was done. The ink dried instantly, sealing his fate. I capped the pen and handed the documents back to the clerk. "Thank you," I said. "Please file these immediately with the county clerk and the Secretary of State." I turned back to Julian. The bailiffs were hauling him to his feet now. He was limp. All the fight drained out of him. He looked smaller, as if the physical act of losing his assets had actually reduced his mass. He was no longer the giant of industry. He was just a man in a rumpled suit who owed too much money. I walked over to him. The bailiffs tensed, ready to intervene, but I held up a hand. "It is all right," I said. "He can't hurt me. He can't afford the lawsuit." I stood directly in front of him. I looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of the man I had once loved. I looked for the charm, the ambition, the spark that had convinced me to marry him 5 years ago, but there was nothing there, just a hollow vacuum of ego and greed. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't a triumph. It wasn't even anger. It was a relief. It was the feeling of dropping a heavy stone that I had been carrying for miles. "You hate me," Julian whispered, his voice broken. "You did this because you hate me." I shook my head slowly. "I don't hate you, Julian," I said softly, my voice intimate enough that only he could hear. "Hate implies passion. Hate implies that you still have power over my emotions. I don't feel hate. I feel nothing." I looked him up and down, taking in the full picture of his ruin. "To me, you are not a husband anymore. You are not even an enemy. You are just a bad debt that I have finally written off the books. You are a tax deduction." Julian flinched. The indifference hurt him more than the anger ever could. Being hated meant he mattered. Being a write-off meant he was nothing. "You said I was an embarrassment," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "You said I was ashamed of your image, but you were wrong about that, too." I leaned in closer, delivering the final truth. "The biggest embarrassment of my life, Julian, is not that I was your wife. It is that I once thought you were worth saving. I spent $20 million trying to prop up a man who was made of papier-mâché. That was a bad investment, and I never make the same mistake twice." I stepped back. I nodded to the bailiffs. "He is all yours," I said. "Please escort the trespasser out of my courtroom." I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I heard Julian start to sob, a ragged, ugly sound of total defeat. But I did not pause. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the floor with a rhythm of absolute freedom. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the hallway. The contrast was blinding. Inside, the air had been heavy with lies and tension. Outside, the corridor was flooded with bright, clean sunlight streaming through the high windows. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that tasted sweet and cold. I glanced down at my wrist. The sunlight caught the crystal face of my Patek Philippe watch. The gold hands glinted. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, timeless and understated. It was worth $300,000 more than the Ferrari Julian had just lost. But unlike Julian, The watch did not need to scream to be valuable. It just worked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had on the speed dial. "Elena," I said when my assistant answered. "Ms. Redmond," Elena's crisp voice came through the line. "How did the hearing go?" "It went exactly according to the model," I said, walking toward the elevators. "The acquisition is complete. We have the papers." "Excellent. Shall I prepare the press release announcing the new leadership of Thorn Tech?" "No," I said. I stopped in front of the elevator. I saw my reflection in the polished metal doors. I saw a woman who looked tired, but strong. I saw a woman who was done with games. "I don't want to lead it, Elena," I said. "I don't want the brand. I don't want a headache. It is a tainted asset." "Then what are your instructions?" "Liquidation," I said, the word tasting decisive and clean. "I want you to trigger the sell-off protocols immediately. Sell the patent portfolio to Google. Sell the customer database to Oracle. Sell the office equipment to a liquidator. And the building. Put the building back on the market. We can probably flip it for a 10% profit by next week." "And the staff?" Elena asked. "The management team." "Dissolve them," I said ruthlessly. "Fire everyone. Severance packages are to be the legal minimum. They watched Julian humiliate me for 5 years and did nothing. I owe them nothing." "Understood," Elena said, the sound of typing already audible in the background. "When do you want this completed?" "I want everything to be clean by dinner," I said. "I want Thorn Tech to cease to exist as a corporate entity by the time I order my appetizer. Scorch the earth, Elena. I want nothing left but cash." "Consider it done, Miss Redmond." I hung up the phone. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside. As the doors began to slide shut, I heard a faint sound coming from the courtroom down the hall. It was a long, drawn-out wail of despair. The sound of a man who had woken up a king and was going to sleep a beggar. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed, sealing the sound away, leaving me in the quiet, peaceful silence of my own making. I watched the numbers on the display start to go down. Ground floor, exit, freedom. I smiled. It was finally time to go get some lunch. I had a feeling the food was going to taste better than it ever had before. Thank you so much for listening to this story of justice and financial vengeance. I hope you enjoyed seeing arrogance get exactly what it deserved. I would love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from right now? Are you listening on your commute, at the gym, or relaxing at home? Please leave a comment below and share your location and your thoughts on Sophia's master plan. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Scarlet Revenge Stories for more tales of dramatic retribution. Don't forget to like this video, and if you really want to support us, smash that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.